And those are some big promises from Kim Jong-un. The dismantling of leading nuclear and missile sites, a joint military liaison team with South Korea, even a first ever trip to Seoul by a North Korean leader. Now the question is, will he keep those promises? In the midst of a 3-day summit in Pyongyang, we're going to take stock of just how far it's all come between the two Koreas since Donald Trump 1 year ago was still calling Kim Rocket Man. Does the President of the United States deserve credit for this moment? Next week, on the sidelines of the annual opening of the UN General Assembly, South Korean President Moon Jae-in will be briefing his U.S. counterpart on his current visit north of the 38th parallel. What will it really take to durably eliminate the threat of a nuclear-armed conflict and the start of a genuinely new chapter in relations? Today in the France 24 debate, we're looking at what is perhaps a breakthrough moment for the two Koreas. With us, France 24's Yenna Lee. Welcome back to former U.S. diplomat Joel Witt, who negotiated with the North Koreans. He joins us from the Stimson Center think tank in Washington. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Also in the U.S. Capitol, Olivia Enos of the Heritage Foundation think tank. Welcome to the show. Théo Clément, who previously taught at the Pyongyang University of Science and Technology. Yeah. I got that right.
Yeah.
He is now at the Lyon Institute of East Asian Studies. Thanks for joining us. The France 24 debate on Facebook and on Twitter, hashtag F24debate. Yeah, they've even announced plans to launch a joint bid to host the 2032 Olympics, the leaders of North and South Korea, with some big announcements at their third face-to-face meeting this year.
For the first time, the South and North have agreed on specific measures for denuclearization. It's a very meaningful achievement.
I promised President Moon Jae-in that I would visit Seoul in the near future.
In the near future, Yenna Lee, if you're a betting woman, would you say we'll see Kim in Seoul soon?
I think we might, indeed. The reaction's going to be very mixed, as per usual. I mean, there were protests out just for this summit in Pyongyang. So a summit in Seoul, I think the anti-communist conservative right will be out and in a huge number. But there'll also be people who will be supporting the event. And I think it could be very big event that we can look forward to.
Happening soon. Joel Witt, how soon?
Oh, look, I've been doing this for 25 years, and I busted my crystal ball a long time ago. So I'm not going to give you a prediction, but I think the point here is he will be visiting Seoul, and I'm not going to predict the timing of it.
What do you make? Is this a breakthrough moment? These are some big pledges on his part.
I think there's a tendency, particularly in the media, to predict that every one of these meetings is a breakthrough moment. So I would say it's not a breakthrough moment. Each meeting has moved the ball forward in an important way, but none of them is a breakthrough moment. We are definitely moving in the right direction, and we have momentum in the right direction. But I'm not going to say it's a breakthrough moment.
He's promising to let in international inspectors at that missile launch site. He's also talking about closing that nuclear facility at Yangbon. That's not a breakthrough moment?
No, they're not breakthrough moments. They're important steps forward. But I think, as everyone understands, the ultimate objective here is denuclearization. And if it's going to work, it's going to be a process, a long process. So there's still a lot of work to do. And, we may have taken a few steps down this road, but there are many more steps to come.
Yeah, he's promising to close that missile launch site in the presence, he says, of foreign experts and permanently scrap North Korea's main Yongbyon nuclear complex. But there's a caveat. He says, if the United States takes, quote, corresponding steps. Olivia Enos, what does Kim want?
I mean, I think that the meetings that we've seen, both between Kim Jong-un and President Trump at the Singapore summit, and also this latest third inter-Korean summit this year. All of these are a broader part of the Kim regime's charm offensive. It's an attempt to sanitize Kim Jong-un's image and to, in many ways, I think, distract from the broader fact that we haven't come to an agreement on even the very definition of denuclearization. The U.S. went in with this requirement that there would be complete, verifiable, irreversible dismantlement of North Korea's nuclear program. And now all that you're seeing, both from the Panmunjom Declaration and now from the Pyongyang Declaration, is an agreement to complete denuclearization, which to North Korea means denuclearization of the entire Korean peninsula and also may include U.S. nuclear, quote-unquote, umbrella nuclear assets. This is an untenable definition of denuclearization, and continuing to hold meetings when we're not seeing clarity in North Korea moving forward to fully denuclearize, I think is quite problematic.
Why is it untenable? Shouldn't the ultimate aim be for all nukes to be off the Korean peninsula?
I think that the reality is that the U.S. doesn't have nuclear weapons on the South Korean peninsula, and South Korea doesn't have nuclear weapons either. What North Korea is referring to is U.S. nuclear assets that are used in emergency measures due to the alliance agreement between South Korea and the U.S. So that's not really the question that's at play. And beyond that, U.S. nuclear assets are legal. What North Korea has violates their own terms when they agreed to the Non-Proliferation Nuclear Agreement. The U.S. doesn't need to give up nuclear assets that it's already secured and agreed not to continue to proliferate. North Korea is the one that needs to sacrifice and give up those particular nuclear assets that they created in violation of international agreements that they agreed to.
Théo Clément, you agree?
No, I don't. I see what Mrs. Enos is trying to say, but basically, I think what Pyongyang is trying to do right now is to make very clear that he wants denuclearize unilaterally, and he needs to move on a diplomatic process and I think a very long negotiating process where each side of the table is going to have to make compromises in order to have the process moving forward. If we expect CVID complete, verifiable, irreversible denuclearization from the DPRK.
So what's the compromise that he's expecting from South Korea and the United States?
Well, I think what the North Korean might want is to be able to verify that the US will never be able to deploy nuclear assets in the Korean peninsula, or maybe in Northeast Asia, because that would be maybe an acceptable security guarantee for them. Obviously, I don't think the US is going to be willing to do such a very strong compromise.
Yeah, one of the reactions on the hashtag F24 debate, you can be simultaneously optimistic about peace building between the Koreas and pessimistic about the denuclearization of the North. Big question, though, is whether the US can tolerate the former without the latter. Théo?
Well, I think that's the big issue. I don't see the US. Maybe it's very hard to predict what the Trump administration is going to say and how they are going to react to a proposal from the North. But I don't think North Korea is going to get rid of their nuclear weapon. I think they are way too important for them. But I think they are trying to create political conditions so that tensions in Northeast Asia are going to be reduced, and that North Korean nuclear weapons might not be such an important issue, same as the Pakistan or the Israel model, if you will.
Joel Witt, you agree?
Look, no, I don't agree. I agree in the sense that this is going to be difficult and a long-term process, but I'm willing to keep an open mind after having dealt with this for 25 years. I don't like predicting the future here, because if we were all sitting here a year ago, we never would have predicted the events that have happened over the past few months. Never in a million years would we have predicted those events. So, you know, we're heading down the right path here, and I think that's important. But I want to address an earlier comment that this is a charm offensive. We are way beyond a charm offensive. North Korea is taking tangible steps. They're not irreversible. That's absolutely true. But it's taking tangible steps forward. And they never have done these kinds of steps before. So we are way beyond the charm offensive, but where this is going to end up, no one can really predict.
How significant is that proposal for a joint sort of military liaison committee between the two Koreas?
Well, I think, if you look at that, and you also need to look at the measures that are being taken, the conventional arms control measures and confidence building measures that both sides agreed to, that is very important because after all, at the end of the day, a way a war is going to start on the Korean Peninsula is not someone using nuclear weapons. It's going to escalate from a conventional clash. So North and South have started moving forward on that front, and it's something that really hardly anyone is paying attention to, and yet it's very significant.
Just let me ask you, when you look, Joel Witt, at the images from today, are these the same North Koreans that you negotiated with back in 1994?
Actually, some of them are literally the same North Koreans because the North Korean foreign minister and their chief negotiator are people who were involved in 1994 and who I've been meeting with ever since. These are very capable, smart people who know the history. And so, they're going to try to get the best deal possible for themselves. But right now, I think things are moving in the right direction. And the other point to make, one last point, in the past, North Korea would never negotiate on its nuclear or missile programs with South Korea. They always insisted on doing that with the United States. So what we're seeing now is something very different from the past.
Olivia Enos, you heard Joel Witt there. It's much more than a charm offensive.
So I would tend to disagree. I think a lot of the things that we're seeing from North Korea are really sort of cosmetic fixes. So a lot of the big promises that they've made are things like shutting down the Seoul testing facility and also obviously the return of the American remains, things along these lines, things actually that we've seen before. But in the case of the Seoul testing site, this is no longer a site that they're really using. Same with the Yongbyon nuclear reactor. Both of these have sort of become obsolete from North Korea's perspective. So giving this up is really not a big sacrifice on their part. They're continuing to maintain the technologies that they have. And in fact, intelligence reports suggest that they're continuing to develop their nuclear program. And beyond this, a lot of the things that our South Korean counterparts agreed to at this latest Pyongyang declaration were increased levels of economic engagement with North Korea, including re-establishing the Kaesong industrial complex and a variety of other related things. All of these are technically in violation of UN and US sanctions. And so South Korea technically doesn't have the ability to promise those things without violating those sanctions that are already in place. I think we have some really serious challenges at play right now when it comes to alliance management and how we're going to go forward in terms of working with our South Korean ally to address the North Korean nuclear threat.
Yeah, Olivia pointing out there that it's not just about denuclearization. There was also talk of road and rail links with the North. Major business executives, including the de facto head of Samsung, J.Y. Lee, accompanying South Korean President Moon Jae-in on his trip. Yenna Lee, you heard there what Olivia was saying about how these plans to move forward with closer economic ties could be in violation of sanctions?
I think President Moon Jae-in is fully aware of the international sanctions that are in place against North Korea, and I don't think he's trying to circumvent these sanctions at all. Inviting Lee Jae-yong to Pyongyang was basically, perhaps it was a way to dangle potential future economic cooperation in front of the North Korean leadership's very eyes.
So let me ask you, Samsung, #1 conglomerate in South Korea, how much does a company like that matter to the North?
Potentially a lot. I mean, there are other conglomerates who have worked more extensively with North Korea than Samsung. Samsung hasn't, as to my knowledge, worked as much with North Korea. But, bringing these people along with him, not just Lee Jae-yong, but a bunch of others, it's not necessarily a plan to circumvent sanctions at all, because even with the inter-Korean railroad network that they're planning, obviously they can't actually put it together before the end of the year. They can only put together a blueprint for it because of sanctions.
How would it even work? How would you get the train rail line to cross the demilitarized zone?
I mean, it's all theoretic, really, but it's the message that counts.
Theo, Clément?
Well, that would be, I mean, having Samsung eventually investing in the DPRK or like in a special economic zone such as in Kaesong would be extremely interesting for the North Korean. They have a very broad industrial base, but they definitely lack technology and know-how. And what they've been trying to do with China, for example, was to attract much more value-added, much more investment in value-added sectors. If the North Koreans are able to do this with South Korea, I think it would be much more happy than with China, who has proven to be a quite dysfunctional economic partner.
You're saying that basically the South Korea, looking ahead, is a better economic partner for North Korea?
I think if we see from a historical perspective, I think the North Koreans are going to play the Chinese and the South Korean against each other for the North Korean market. Eventually, down the road, if tensions are military, diplomatic, and political tension are being reduced, I definitely see Pyongyang trying to play Beijing and Seoul against each other to compete for the North Korean markets.
On the hashtag F24Debate, one viewer commenting, I think both North and South Korea have decided to end tensions irrespective of what the U.S. stance is. It's in the interest of both. North Korea needs it for their economy, South Korea for its own security. You agree with this, Joel Witt, that in the end, South Korea is a much more viable economic partner than China for Pyongyang?
Well, I don't know about that. I mean, I think your previous guess is right, that the North Koreans are going to play off South Korea and China and get the most out of it that they can. That's just their standard operating procedure. But what I can say is they're much more interested in economic ties with both of them than they are with the United States. I mean, a lot of people in Washington have this fantasy that what the North Koreans want is to lift all the U.S. sanctions and open up the economic relationship with the United States. That's not what they're looking for. From the United States, they are looking for a different bilateral relationship, moving away from the tensions that have existed for decades. And that opens the door for them to establish economic relations with other countries, particularly South Korea. So I think that's the North Korean objective here.
When we come back, we're going to take a look now at how Washington fits into this North-South Korea calculus. Stay with us. You're watching the France 24 debate. Welcome back, or welcome if you're just joining us. It's the France 24 debate. We're speaking on a day of big announcements out of Pyongyang from the leaders of the two Koreas. Second and third day of their summit there. With us to talk about it, France 24's Yenna Lee, former U.S. diplomat Joel Witt. He joins us from the Stimson Center think tank in Washington. Also in the U.S. Capitol, Olivia Enos of the Heritage Foundation and Théo Clément of the Lyon Institute of East Asian Studies, who taught political economy, you said?
Yeah, political economy.
In Pyongyang before. Yep. Yenna, let me ask you, because let's talk about it's day 2 of the summit, third day coming up. They're going to go visit Mount Paektu.
Yes.
Explain to us why and what the significance of that is.
Hugely symbolic. It's the highest peak on the Korean peninsula, and for North Koreans apparently it's sacred because that's where they say their founder was born, and for South Koreans it's really symbolic as well. It's a national symbol because it even features in the first line of our national anthem. It's a mountain with a huge significance for both sides, and I think it's another way that the two leaders are giving a strong image. This isn't, this is another occasion for them during another meeting they've had to say, this is the image we're going. It's a strong image. People will love it back home. South Koreans will appreciate this image.
They'll appreciate the image. Moon Jae-in earlier attending the mass games. They take place every 5 years in North Korea. Now, there was a previous visit by one of his predecessors back in 2007, Roh Moo-yeon, who went to those mass games in Pyongyang. And there was political backlash for going to that.
In South Korea, I think the conservative right will often talk about how propaganda plays out when there are meetings between their leaders and North Koreans. But even if you can say that maybe visually it's not good, you have to think about what engaging with North Korea means. I mean, if you speak in their language, I think from the moment Moon Jae-in stepped off the plane in Pyongyang, Kim Jong-un has just been showering him with respect, actually. This is his way of showing respect, I believe.
All right. And while he's in Pyongyang, back in Seoul, nationalists have once again, as Yenna was saying, been rallying against any concessions. Now, France 24's team met with some of the 32,000 who live in South Korea and who fled the north. It's a story read by Selena Sykes.
As a child in Pyongyang, he lived on the streets and lost his leg after being hit by a train. Ji Song-ho later achieved the impossible, fleeing to North Korea to seek refuge in Seoul. Today, he's one of a rare few speaking up against the Inter-Korean summit.
President Moon Jae-in is meeting many important people and is eating in good restaurants in Pyongyang, but he's not seeing all the people who are suffering.
For him, the current negotiations are skirting around a fundamental issue: human rights.
There are still people imprisoned in work camps in North Korea. People are continuing to die from diseases and starve to death. I'm speaking out for them today.
January 2018. Washington and Pyongyang are on the verge of armed conflict. Ji Song-ho is invited to Donald Trump's State of Union address. He becomes known as the man who fled North Korea on crutches and a symbol of the country's barbarity. But South Koreans are optimistic about the latest developments.
I'm very happy. I almost cried today.
I'm very happy about the summit. Now I think that the two Koreas could finally be reunified soon.
Ji Song-ho also hopes for reunification. The activist runs a North Korean organization aiming to influence the negotiations. The members know the regime firsthand and say it hasn't changed. Some are still living in fear.
I don't think the regime is ever going to give up its nuclear weapons, because they see them as their only way to survive. They've been saying that they'll give them up for the last 30 years, but nothing has happened. The government is built on lies and is living a lie.
The South Korean government knows there's a risk that North Korea will not follow through on its commitments. Pyongyang's human rights record has been sidelined, so as not to jeopardize the US's fundamental goal: a nuclear-free Korean peninsula.
Theo Clément, your reaction when you hear Ji Song-ho, that North Korean on crutches we heard in that report, say that with this visit, human rights are being ignored?
Well, I definitely understand why people might be concerned about human rights, the human rights situation in the DPRK, especially if there are refugees. But I think if we really want to talk about human rights with the DPRK, we first have to create trust-building measures and get closer with North Korea and try to learn how to talk to them. At some point, we will be able, if there is enough trust, at some point we'll be able to address issues such as human rights. Because if we go if we discuss human rights first and then try to move on other subjects, that's never going to work with the North Koreans. So I think it's gonna have to be first political dialogue, reducing tensions, and then down the road talk about more sensitive issues.
You agree with that, Olivier Enos? First, if you want to make any headway when it comes to human rights, you first have to talk about political issues.
So when I attended the was in Singapore during the Singapore summit, I was there almost exclusively to talk about the serious human rights violations going on in North Korea. Today, there's between 80,000 to 120,000 individuals in political prison camps, and more than 400,000 people have died in those camps. Those are people in the most dire situations, but even the average North Korean can be arrested for simply reading a Bible or watching a South Korean drama. Ji Sung-ho is an incredibly brave North Korean refugee who's speaking out and really highlighting the fact that even by the South Korean government's accounts, they've been silencing North Korean refugees, including one of the highest level North Korean defectors, Tae Young-ho, and have been making it almost impossible for us to have human rights conversations with North Korea. It was also concerning that President Trump didn't really seem to raise a whole lot of issues when it came to human rights issues at the Singapore summit. And I think that when we continue to have these these détentes, but then we just brush over the really serious human rights abuses that are going on in North Korea. This is really serious, not just from a moral standpoint, but because the human rights abuses reveal something fundamental about the regime. They view human rights abuses as a means of maintaining their grip on power. And I think that in order to make forward progress on nuclear negotiations, we can't ignore human rights issues.
Can't ignore it, but do you put it first in the conversation?
You know, I think diplomats are always faced with really hard questions about how to prioritize various issues. And I think rather than pitting the two issues together, diplomats need to make a case for why improvements on human rights issues can happen at the same time as eliminating the nuclear and missile threat from North Korea. I think we need to do a better job of creating synergies between these two various challenges and making it clear that North Korea cannot and will not receive the respect from the international community that it wants until it addresses the serious human rights violations going on there today.
Before I ask Joel Witt about it, Yenna, when you were reporting for us back in May from Seoul and other parts of South Korea, did you get a sense that the conversation about human rights, remember it was on the heels of what, that second meeting between the two leaders, was kind of being suppressed, as Olivia was saying?
I wouldn't say I felt that it was being suppressed, but it wasn't something we were often talking about because the focus was on how successful everything's been going from Moon Jae-in's point of view. And it's true, he's really been the man in the middle of this détente between the US and North Korea.
Joel Witt, if you want human rights to improve in North Korea, what's the strategy?
Well, look, you know, I spent a lot of time in the State Department. I've spent a lot of time in the policy community here in Washington. I spent a lot of time with human rights activists, and people were very concerned about it. And I've been in North Korea, so I've seen things firsthand. And what I can tell you from that experience and from talking to North Koreans quite a lot is that naming and shaming North Korea as a human rights violator is not going to work. They are just going to dig their heels in. So the pragmatic way of achieving real results in human rights is to push forward with this political dialogue, push forward with the security issues, but also embedding in that discussion the issue of human rights. And hopefully that's what the U.S. government will do. Once again, I can't predict what they'll do. But at this point in the discussion, I think it's somewhat premature.
Somewhat premature? Olivia Enos is suggesting that you can do those things in parallel.
I think she's actually, I agree with her on that. I'm sorry, I agree with her on that. I think you can incorporate it. But it's just a question of getting momentum behind the dialogue and then gradually mixing in the human rights issues. And believe me, that's based on 20 years of experience talking to the North Koreans. And if you do it that way, they will listen.
Olivia Enos, it's a very black and white picture of North Korea we seem to be getting from the current U.S. president. Donald Trump went from calling Kim Jong-un Rocket Man to, we heard him just earlier from the White House saying that he received a great letter from him earlier this week. Are the human rights concerns being pushed by the U.S. president?
I think early on this year, you saw the president devoting a lot of attention to human rights abuses in North Korea. Obviously, he had Jeong-so at the State of the Union address. Prior to that, he gave a really compelling speech before the South Korean National Assembly, criticizing North Korea on human rights grounds. And he's even had North Korean refugees to the White House prior to the Singapore summit to hear out many of the concerns and the abuses that they experienced when they lived above the 38th parallel. But I think we've seen since Singapore a willingness to sort of overlook a lot of those human rights abuses in a way that I think is unhelpful. I think that the administration should be doing a better job of messaging that even its policy of maximum pressure sanctions towards North Korea has the ability to improve human rights abuses, because my research demonstrates that when greater sanctions are instituted, there is an increase in the informal economy and in growth in the informal economy in North Korea. Access to outside information inflation and goods increases as those informal economic markets grow in North Korea. And so I believe that the administration should do a better job of basically messaging that we have the ability to improve information access, to improve individual North Koreans' ability to make decisions for themselves about whether they want to facilitate change from within North Korea or flee the regime and facilitate change from the outside, like we see defectors like Ji Sung-ho doing.
Théo Clément?
Well, I don't think we should be getting confused between what sanctions are here for. That is putting pressure on the North Korean regime to alter its calculation on the nuclear issue, and using sanctions to actually provoke more important change within North Korea. I don't think anyone, especially at the United Nations Security Council, should be concerned with what's going on inside the DPRK besides a security issue, which is why what the Security Council is here for. So if we use the sanctions as a means for political interference, that I think it can only backfire, especially in North Korea.
Remind us again your dates when you worked in North Korea.
Sorry?
Your dates when you worked in North Korea.
The last time I've been there was 2017.
And how cut off from the rest of the world did Pyongyang seem to you?
It's really hard to say because as a foreigner in the DPRK, you don't feel cut off. You have access to the internet, so it's basically like being anywhere in the world. It's hard to interact with locals like you do in France or anywhere else in the world. But when I was teaching in Pyongyang, and I had very meaningful contacts with my students that were extremely controlled, extremely restricted, but still had some meaningful discussions, including on political topics, including sanctions.
And this issue of sanctions, of course, it goes both ways. We have the president saying one thing. We have members of his administration, though, stringently keeping to the line of sanctions. The same, Donald Trump tweeting earlier, it's very exciting, we've come a long way. But 48 hours earlier, the exchanges were testy at the UN Security Council in New York, where the U.S. ambassador accused Russia of systematically flouting sanctions with ship-to-ship transfers of oil, coal, and other goods.
Russia has been cheating, and now they've been caught. Despite its repeated support for UN sanctions, Russia is actively working to undermine the enforcement of the Security Council's sanctions on North Korea.
It is impossible to resolve the nuclear issue of the peninsula only through sanctions and pressure on Pyongyang. Sanctions cannot replace diplomacy.
Joel, what do you make of that exchange we saw at the UN Security Council Tuesday?
Well, I don't know if you can see it, but I have a big smile on my face because the idea that we just caught Russia cheating is laughable. The fact is, for decades now, the North Koreans have been able to circumvent UN sanctions, in large part because of the help of the Chinese, and in part because of help from the Russians, in part because of help from countries around the world, whether you're talking about in Africa or Southeast Asia. So in my estimation of the history of this issue, we put a lot of hope in sanctions, and I think it's been false hopes all the way. Sanctions will put pressure on North Korea. It will make their lives more difficult. But don't forget, during the period of the most intense sanctions we had on North Korea, they advanced their nuclear weapons program, they built an ICBM, and also the economy in North Korea over the past few years has actually gotten a lot better. So I think we put too much emphasis on sanctions, and we need to be more serious about finding peaceful paths forward.
Well, Olivia Enos, I'll let you answer.
I think that sanctions have a mixed track record of working, but I think one of the more successful sanctions that we instituted against North Korea were implemented in 2005 when we instituted sanctions against Banco Delta Asia, a bank in Macau that was known for laundering money to North Korea. U.S. government officials who happened to engage with North Koreans at that time report that North Koreans said that it made it much more difficult for them to continue their nuclear and missile program. And that's why I think the U.S. has transitioned in recent years to emphasizing the use of targeted financial measures, which are financial-based sanctions, as opposed to more of the broad-based trade sanctions that I think have been proven really unsuccessful in the North Korean context. I also wanted to clarify a comment earlier on. One of the panelists noted that it didn't seem appropriate for sanctions to be applied to anything other than the missile and nuclear program in North Korea. But the U.S. and definitely the United States has instituted sanctions specifically on human rights grounds. Under the Obama administration, we designated Kim Jong-un and 10 other North Koreans and 10 other North Korean entities specifically on human rights grounds after the United Nations released their 2014 report finding that North Korea committed crimes against humanity. I think we need to be using targeted financial measures that raise the risk to individuals in North Korea to continue to engage in illicit behavior, whether that's dealing with the weapons program or dealing with human rights abuses.
Yenna-Lee?
I'm sorry, but I'm going to interject here because I've been working on a new history of relations with North Korea. And so this idea of Banco Delta Asia as having this enormous impact and we can just replicate that experience, I think is really not accurate. The fact is it did have an impact. That was 2005. And ever since then, people keep saying, why don't we do Banco Delta Asia again? So in 2013, we did do targeted economic sanctions, and the Treasury officials thought that would have a big impact, and it had no impact whatsoever. So the idea that we can use these targeted sanctions to really pinch North Korea is just, I think, really misleading for people. They have an impact, but there's no magic solution out there.
Yeah, I definitely agree with what Mr. Wood said.
Olivia Enos.
I think one of the challenges is that, you know, many people look at the Trump administration's policy and say, oh, this is maximum pressure. We've already hit North Korea with everything that we've got. But the reality is that the Trump administration has stopped short of maximum pressure. In particular, it has yet to have targeted a single Chinese bank. And as I think all of the panelists have acknowledged, China plays a really big role in North Korea's ability to evade sanctions. But for whatever reason, we've stopped short of designating those individual Chinese banks, even though we have designated other Chinese entities. I think this is a huge mistake, and I think that there are still areas where we can sort of close the loop with North Korea, and we might see additional success and actually see a genuine maximum pressure policy in place.
You yourself have been saying that you wish that Donald Trump in Singapore had talked more about human rights. We're hearing Nikki Haley, the U.S. ambassador to the United Nations, speak very stringently about sanctions. Is there one U.S. policy when it comes to Korea, or are there several U.S. policies right now?
I don't think that it's in opposition to each other to be pursuing a maximum pressure policy that prioritizes primarily squeezing North Korea when it comes to the nuclear issues or otherwise, and then also having individuals at the United Nations or elsewhere be raising serious concerns.
So the State Department and the White House are singing from the same hymn sheet.
I mean, I'm not in the U.S. government, so being able to discern whether or not they're both, on reading off the same sheet of music is impossible for me to determine. But I think that there is a genuine attempt to try and institute additional pressure against North Korea and sort of see what comes at them in terms of potential opportunities for negotiation.
Joel Witt, do you credit Donald Trump with when that strong talk last year perhaps sparking these breakthroughs we've seen over the past year?
Well, I think they may have played some role, but I think we over-exaggerate the role that they did play. In fact, I met with senior North Korean government officials a week after President Trump won the election, and they said they were open to talking to the United States. They wanted to start a dialogue with the United States. And I have friends who were in the U.S. intelligence community who tell me that in 2016, the North Koreans actually made the decision to pursue the initiatives that we're seeing today. So maximum pressure may have had some effect, but I think we're kidding ourselves that our measures brought them to the negotiating table.
On the hashtag F24debate, Eric saying they're still making nukes and this whole thing is just a show. North Korea gains legitimacy and Trump gets a pretend win, Yana Lee. In the end, it will fall apart and go back to normal?
I think it's an important point to reiterate what Joel Witt said earlier about how the declaration they came up with at Pyongyang this time around does have some substance than we predicted when it comes to maybe not the nuclear aspect, but with conventional weapons. We forget often, because the US is so obsessed with the nuclear power that North Korea has amassed, we forget that there are 25 million South Koreans who live just in the greater Seoul region alone, and that's within conventional arms reach of North Korea. So in this declaration, when they talk about creating buffer zones, creating no-fly zones, trying to reduce potential deadly clashes along the border on land and sea borders, it's already quite a substance in the declaration.
When you think back to February, South Korea hosting the Olympics, Kim's sister showing up for the opening ceremony, she's in the same review stand as the US vice president. And all that's happened since. What are your thoughts now as we stand? It's only September.
There's a lot of things that have happened. And as somebody on the panel said earlier, things that we could never have imagined a year ago. And I think it's just important that, as Mr. Witt said earlier, it's a process, denuclearization. It's not just something that you can tick off. It's every time we engage, that's not fighting. That means we're not fighting.
Théo Clément?
Yeah, in February this year, everybody was amazed to see Kim Jong-nam and Kim Jong-un's sister going to Seoul and interacting with Moon Jae-in. And today we've seen Moon Jae-in going to Pyongyang. It feels at the same time a historical moment, but also back to normal, like two countries talking to each other and moving forward. And I think we've made enormous progress. And going back to the sanction issue, I think now it's time to maybe dial down the sanctions to let the process go down the road, because it's no breakthrough yet. It's still we are still at the very symbolic level, but I think there is some interesting potential right now.
So what happens when Moon Jae-in, the president of South Korea, briefs Donald Trump next week when they sit down at the UN General Assembly?
Well, when it comes to when you have to factor in Donald Trump, it's always very hard to predict the future. But if Moon Jae-in is able to, Moon Jae-in is a very good strategist, and he is able to make Donald Trump understand that the process is actually good for the United States, that South Korea trilateral dialogue between North, South, and the US, if it's going forward, if it reduces tensions, I think that might be a wonderful opportunity for Seoul, for Pyongyang, and for Washington.
Joel Witt, does President Moon have Donald Trump's ear?
I think he does. I think he's had a long conversation with President Trump, convincing him that what's going on is in President Trump's interest. And also President Trump seems very committed to this whole process. So I think that relationship is working very well. The big problem in the United States, which you haven't talked about, is the upcoming midterm election, which is the beginning of November. And it's likely that the Democrats are at least going to retake the House of Representatives, and there may be a chance they might take the Senate, although that's not likely. And what will the impact of that be on this process? Because a number of Democrats, as you know, are not very supportive of President Trump. So that could upset this process. But hopefully the Democrats will understand that everything that's going on is in the U.S. national interest, and they'll grudgingly give support for the process moving forward.
We shall see, indeed. Joel Witt, many thanks for joining us from Washington. Olivia Enos, also in the U.S. Capitol. Théo Clément, Yana Lee. And thank you for being with us here in the France 24 debate.